The theme of our second workshop is the new name. In the book of Revelation, it talks about us being given a white stone with a new name on it. And throughout the scriptures, there are characters who receive a new name from God. The life of Jacob is one of the most poignant stories of the new name, because the new name he's given is Israel. He is the father of the 12 tribes, and through him, all the promises that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob find their fulfillment, which is why on that first slide we have all the stars of the sky, or at least something that looks a bit like it. But you'll notice that the title of this slideshow is Learning to Limp. This is about Jacob's toughest life lesson. Throughout his life, he'd been extremely independent. And when he finally wrestled with the angel couldn't overcome him, and he touched him in the hip so that he went on his way limping. When he wrestled with the angel, he was at the lowest point in his life. He had enemies behind him, enemies in front of him. He'd done everything in his own strength to overcome his enemies, but he realized that he was completely dependent on God for some kind of blessing to get through and get hold of his destiny. So he had to learn to limp. And we as Christians have to learn to limp into our destiny. We become wounded healers. We're wounded because all of our strengths are dealt with by God. The things that we've done in our own strength, his strength is made perfect in weakness. And of course, our example is Jesus, the perfect weakness of Jesus, which brought us our salvation and the life that we have now. So I'm going to take you through the life of Jacob, and we're particularly going to look at the stones from which he built monuments and altars in his life. Every time there was a significant meeting with God in his life, he would build an altar of stones, gather up the stones around and build the stones up into a monument so that people who pass by would remember something of his story, of what happened at that place. The name Jacob was not a great name to have. It means grasper, supplanter, usurper, and deceiver. And at one point in his life, Esau, his brother, said, "Isn't he rightly named?" Esau was the elder brother, and Jacob, as the younger brother, one of twins, came out of the womb hanging onto his brother's heel as a grasper or as a supplanter. And the naming of him and the actions around his birth were all prophetic. They were indicative of what God had for him and the struggles that were involved for him in getting hold of his destiny. His mother, Rebecca, had been given something of a revelation, and we're not sure whether his father, Isaac, had the same revelation. But when Rebecca finally got pregnant after a couple of decades of marriage, she found that the pregnancy was incredibly uncomfortable. And she went to the Lord and said, "What is going on?" And he said, "There are two nations at war in your womb, and the elder will serve the younger." So she had the revelation that the elder would not be the superior of the two in the sight of God, that God had a plan for the younger one. And as I said, we don't know if Isaac was aware of this, but the boys worked out this destiny throughout their lives. They were not mates, they were not friends. They competed with one another, and they're also quite different. At the same time, the parents were competing over these boys. Apparently, Rebecca favoured Jacob, not only because she'd heard the promises over his life, but he was more like her. He was a homebody. He could be found in the kitchen making soup and things like that, whereas Esau, we're told, was a hairy man. He was also a very turbulent man. He wasn't a man who stuck to the rules. He married wives that his parents didn't approve of. So he was always out in the fields, he was out hunting, and his father Isaac loved him for it because he was more like his father. So you'll hear stories that the competitiveness between the parents created the enmity, but really there was the destiny of God was in what was happening between these two. It was in their nature to struggle. They were struggling against one another from the beginning. So the very first time that Jacob tries to take his brother's birthright, we're told that Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage, for a bowl of soup. What it was Esau had been out in the paddock hunting. He came in, he was exhausted, he was tired, he was hungry, and he saw Jacob making a lentil soup. And he basically said, I'll pay you anything, give me my soup. You know, I'm about to die and I'm not worried about anything at all. And Jacob says, well, I want your birthright. And he says, yeah, have it. You know, what does it mean to me? My hunger is all I want to satisfy. And so Esau handed over his birthright, probably not very seriously or not very thoughtfully, but it gives you an idea of what he thought of his heritage. But the real contest between them came years later when Isaac was dying. And Rebekah heard her husband saying to Esau, go out, kill an animal for me, come back, cook me something that I really want to eat, then I'll give you a blessing and I'll die. And so Esau went out to hunt, and while he was out, Rebekah said to Jacob, you're going to get the blessing. I'm going to dress you up as a hairy man. And the two of them colluded to deceive the father, and the father, a bit cautiously, he wasn't completely deceived, he wasn't 100% sure, but he gave the blessing of the firstborn to Jacob by their deception. That led to the most tragic cry of Esau's life when he came back, having said, you know, wasn't my brother rightly named a deceiver, a usurper? But he said to his father, haven't you reserved any blessing for me? Haven't you got anything for me? And it's quite interesting how Isaac at this point says, well, no, you know, I've given him the blessing and he will be blessed. Now, Isaac does give Esau some kind of blessing, but not the blessing that was due to him as the eldest son. And it's at this point that I begin to think that maybe Isaac had a bit of a revelation about the role of Jacob. But the reason that I'm looking at this, the reason I want to look at Esau is because if you heard this story in Sunday school, they might have passed over Esau. He doesn't get very good publicity in the New Testament. That's where we get the idea that, you know, that he just gave up his birthright for a mess of pottage, that he didn't care. But he was a son. And as a son, he looked for his parents' blessing. And this empty box is important because it reminds us that in everything in our life, when we're striving, when we're looking for a blessing, when we're looking for prominence, when we're looking for anything, and particularly in our family of birth and in our subsequent families, there are other people around us who are affected by our actions. And these people, in Jacob's case, these people could become our enemies. They can work against us. And they're the people that we're going to have to be reconciled to. They're the people we're going to have to forgive. And they are very much part of our story. And so that empty box represents the love language of Esau. The blessing was really important to him. And I guess that in some ways his birthright wasn't important, but those words coming out of his father's mouth would have been. And in their culture, somehow those words are spoken only once, and they have this incredible legal value. The unfortunate thing was that once Jacob had stolen the blessing as well as the birthright, the enmity between the boys was going to lead to murder. And both mother and father urged Jacob to go away. And when they sent him away, they were sending him basically to go and find a wife that was better than the kind of wives that Esau had taken from the tribes around that were causing trouble for the family. And that might have been a deciding factor for Isaac in sending his son away, and even in giving him the blessing in what was a really weak deception. So they sent Jacob away, and Jacob, from that moment on, he had the promises of God. He was a godly man. He had encountered God. He understood the birthright. He understood that he was the heir to what had been promised to Abraham and Isaac. And he was very mindful of what he needed to do. So we'll just go on. Jacob basically reaped what he had sown. It's one of the great paradoxes of God's goodness that he continued to pursue a flawed man. There's no doubt about it that Jacob was a deceiver and that he had taken things in his own strength that God had promised to him. But God continued to pursue him, continued to bless him in all of the things that were important in his culture, which was wives and cattle. It was provision. So God was gracious to Jacob. Some of the stories that we read are quite amazing. For example, the wives. If we begin with the wives, he saw Rachel and he desired Rachel. Rachel was the daughter of his uncle Laban, where he'd run to for shelter, to hide, to work, to find a wife, to get away from Esau. And so he saw Rachel, he desired her, and he went to Laban and he asked for her. And Laban's agreement was, work for me for 7 years and you can have her. And then on the night of the marriage, when we presume everyone was a bit drunk, he substituted Rachel for Leah. We're told that she had weak eyes. She may have actually been blind. She certainly wasn't as beautiful as her sister. And so Jacob found himself with a wife that he did not want. And when he went back to Laban and argued with him, Laban came up with a weak excuse that, no, we don't give the younger daughter first. You've got to take the older daughter first. And Laban's condition was another 7 years of labor to get hold of the wife that he really wanted. And Jacob was prepared to do that because what he wanted was what he wanted. He was a man who went after what he really wanted in life. We have the same story with the cattle. Eventually, Laban, the uncle, comes along and says, look, I don't want you to work for me for nothing anymore. Let's do a deal and I'll pay you. And Jacob said, no, don't pay me, but just give me all of the really second-rate sheep and goats, the ones with the spots and the stripes. And then by some peculiar method, almost it seems like divination, Jacob made sure that many striped and spotted goats and sheep were produced. He moved those herds to another place, and he basically became wealthy in his livestock, which caused division. So all of that time, Jacob was prospering. He now had wives, he had children, he had sheep and goats. He was doing well. He was still working for Laban, but Laban's sons were beginning to mutter against him. So there was conflict coming. And then eventually Laban himself felt completely robbed by his nephew, and division came. And there was still the question of Jacob's destiny, because his destiny was not in his uncle's country, among his uncle's tribesmen. It was way back where Rebekah and Isaac and Esau and his own family had settled. And so this was it was a difficult time for Jacob because he couldn't remain where he was. And not only that, but his wives were saying, look, we don't trust our father. Their father was the deceiver. Their father was the grasping one. And they were saying to Jacob, let's get out of here. So what happens next is really very important because Jacob makes a getaway and Laban comes after him. And Laban here reveals himself as a man who has his own love language, which has made him a deceiver and a grasper. And what he says is quite surprising. He says, these women are my daughters. The children are as my children, meaning the grandchildren. The children are as my children, and the flocks are my flocks. And that tells me that in all the time that Jacob was working for Laban, Laban was happy to have his labor, but he really wasn't letting go of the things that were had moved into Jacob's sphere, but had not really become Jacob's property. So Laban had proprietorship over his daughters, their children, and the flocks, and he had no right. But at the same time, Jacob needed to negotiate a peace. And Laban said the main reason that he'd come after them was because someone had stolen his gods. In actual fact, it was one of his daughters that had stolen his gods. So Jacob negotiated a peace there. And it was a treaty made by a pile of stones that they heaped up. And there was a letting go of the past, a relinquishing of the past, so that Jacob could move on. And the word mitzvah became very popular in Victorian times. You'll see a lot of brooches in antique shops with the word mitzvah on it. And it's been used as a kind of romantic symbol, although it was never intended for that in the scriptures. It's not in the least bit romantic. And so what people understood was may God watch between you and me until we are reunited. And so when people were going off to war, they gave their beloved a mitzvah brooch that God would watch between them. But the watching of God was between these two men who were in fierce competition with one another. So in landing in Laban's camp, Jacob had come upon a man who was just like himself, and he contended with him. Under God, he had prospered, but his own strength had been expended in it. The difficulty now was that Jacob had to go back in the direction of his own home. And it's here that he has to really cry out to God, because he's got Laban behind him and he's got Esau in front of him. And it's here in Genesis that he prays, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." So here he is claiming his ancestral promises from God. He was a godly man. He believed very deeply in God who had made promises. And so despite all the strife behind him, he turns to God now to deal with the strife that's in front of him. And I'm sure he recognizes, that all of his own striving to prosper in his own strength hasn't come to a great deal, because he could be wiped out now by his brother. So he has to make peace with an offended brother. So in Genesis 32, we read that that Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." And Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, "Jacob." And in answering that, "This is my name, Jacob," deceiver, usurper. In naming himself, he's admitting to his old nature. And now, having wrestled, he's told, the man said, "Your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." And so at this moment, the new name of Israel, which is such a powerful name, and you can make a study of that, what Israel means. And you can make a study of the whole of Israel and see how the life of Israel, the nation, is so much like the life of Jacob, the man who wrestled with God and went on his way limping. So now we come to Bethel, which is another pillar of stones, another monument. And here what we have is we have a man whose name has been changed through his contention and struggling with God. His old nature has been wiped away. He's no longer coming towards his brother in the strength of his own arm. He's coming believing in the promises of God. He's a changed man, and he's a man with a new name. And so he takes the stones and he sets up the pillar, he sets up this altar at Bethel afresh. And it's a place of greater promises, but it's also a place of great losses. So when we understand that he's going on his way limping, in his future journey, he is going to lose a beloved wife, and there are going to be other losses in his life. Things are going to change for him. His life is not going to be easy. He's not going to sort of be singing Kumbaya with his brother Esau, but he's going forward as Israel to inherit the promises. So the stones are so important once again. And if we think of the altars that we can set up, they will be made up of stones where we have wrestled with God to have parts of our old nature removed and destroyed. And we can lay them down as stones. You know, the Jewish people have a habit when they go to visit a grave of leaving a stone on the end of the grave. And there's many understandings of what that stone represents. But for most people, it represents pain. It represents something that causes them to walk away sadder and wiser. And it's the same when we set up an altar of stones. So the thing that we need to draw out of this is, before we try to change our circumstances, let God change us. Because every time God changes us, we actually acquire a new name. For example, if we're a person who contends with God because we have a problem with anger in our life, and our anger has brought us enemies and trouble, and we contend with God, and we come to God, and what we do is we say to God, you know, I've got a Laban in my life, and I've got an Esau in my life, and I need you to change them and to fix them. And what God really wants to do is he wants to change us so that we see them differently. And so Laban and Esau hadn't blessed Jacob in many ways. They had contended with him. They had been difficult for him. But at the same time, in order to move on, he had to make peace with those experiences and with those people. So as long as we are fighting Laban and Esau, we are not really in a place to move on. But when we are reconciled to the people that God allows to come into our life, and these people can be sharpening us as iron sharpens iron, they can be making our life very, very difficult. But when we become reconciled to them before God, as we prayerfully relinquish, let go in our struggle to actually forgive, and it has to be a struggle, it's always a struggle, to really joyfully greet these people as Esau and Jacob eventually came back together and greeted one another. Although they didn't live as brothers, they certainly went their separate ways again. But Jacob was prepared to pay an incredible price of nearly everything he had acquired. He was prepared to give that to his brother for the sake of peace. Now, in the end, he didn't have to do it. But when we struggle to achieve forgiveness with our enemies, with the people we've contended with, we don't have to make them our friends, but emotionally we have to release the debt, release the grudges. We have to release it. It sets us free. It makes us incredibly free. And also it restores us in our relationship with God. Because every time we come before God, if we're still contending with people, that's a blockage. It's something that gets in the way of us having an open, loving relationship with God. And so before we try to change circumstances, let God change us. And then we take the stone of anger, of resentment and unforgiveness, and it becomes the part of the altar that we build. And then we take on the new name. And the new name will be the opposite. It'll be completely the opposite. In fact, once we have wrestled with God, with something big in our life, whether it could be an addiction, it can be hatred, it can be anger, it can be unforgiveness, it can be fear, it can be anxiety, it can be victim mentality, a tendency to be easily hurt and to be resentful. Whatever it is that we need to contend with, the new name that God gives us is the opposite. And so if we have been graceless in our life, then our new name becomes grace. And if we have been faithless in our life, doing everything in our own strength, then our new name becomes faith. And that is what's written on the white stone, this white stone that God gives us. This is the gift that he gives us, the gift of a new name. I want to finish off with the prayer of Jabez, because there was probably no one in the scriptures apart, I think probably Mara was, a name that equaled, which means bitter, in the story of Naomi and Ruth. That name probably equals the name Jabez. But the thing about Jabez is some versions of the Bible will tell you that the name translates pain, but it actually doesn't. It's one of those words that rhymes with. It's almost the kind of word that schoolboy bullies would get hold of because of the way that it rhymes with this word, pain. And his mother has used this play on words because she's saying, I gave birth to him in pain. It was such a pain, giving birth to him. But obviously the name had caused him pain. And his experience of life was pain and rejection, which he both put down to his name as, put it down in his life to, the name the mother had given him. But there was a deeper thing. He might have even thought it was some kind of curse in his life. And so he cries out to God and he says, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm so that I will be free from pain. And God granted his request. Now, the prayer of Jabez is one of those prayers that you can buy in Christian bookshops. It's been written out many times. Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm so that I will be free from pain. So people interpret that as they want. And we may not want to have a bigger backyard. You mightn't want your territory enlarged. But we do want the blessing of God. And I think the end result of this story is that no matter what names we have acquired in life, through our character, through our behaviour and our attitudes, all of those names mean absolutely nothing in the providence of God, because he can give us a new name. And I think it's very important for us to always reject negative names. And most of all, never give ourselves negative names. Don't call yourself names. Don't put labels on yourself. Don't restrict yourself. Where it talks about enlarging your territory, every time you feel inclined to put yourself down with a little name or nasty name, enlarge yourself by replacing it immediately. And if it's something you need to pray over, then do it and to relinquish it. If it's something that is an obstacle in your life, like, you might sort of not be happy with your body shape or something like that, and you're putting a curse on yourself constantly by the way you talk about it. And you need to come back to the Lord and say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and my name is Beulah. My name is beautiful. So we have to work with God to enlarge ourselves, to know the names that He calls us, and to reject the names that God would never give us. Thanks for listening to this. This is not the fullness of the workshop. You're going to need some other materials which we're hoping to get up online in the near future.